Welcome to Whispered Tales, where we bring you inspiring stories and practical tips to improve your life. Today, we'll explore a journey to speak English 10 times clearer, faster, and with confidence. Sarah had always loved the idea of communicating fluently in English, but reality was far from the dream. Despite studying for years and memorizing countless grammar rules and vocabulary, she found herself struggling in everyday conversations. Words felt jumbled, her sentences stumbled, and she often noticed people nod politely without truly understanding her. It wasn't a lack of knowledge. Sarah knew plenty of words, but her speech lacked clarity, pace, and confidence. She remembered moments in school, at work, or even casual gatherings where she had to repeat herself, or worse, avoid speaking altogether because she feared sounding unclear. Those experiences had quietly chipped away at her self-esteem over the years. One rainy evening, while scrolling through her phone, she came across a podcast about improving spoken English. The host promised strategies to speak 10 times clearer, techniques used by professional speakers, and practical exercises that could transform the way learners communicated. Sarah felt a spark of hope. Could it really be possible to change the way she spoke, to make her words crisp, precise, and easy to understand? The very next day, she started experimenting. She recorded herself reading simple paragraphs aloud. At first, the results were discouraging. Her speech was fast, uneven, and muddled, and playback made her wince. But instead of giving up, Sarah decided to approach the problem systematically. She realized that clarity wasn't just about knowing English. It was about pronunciation, pacing, intonation, and confidence. Sarah began a new routine: slow reading exercises to master pronunciation, shadowing native speakers to mimic natural rhythm, daily tongue twister drills to strengthen articulation, recording and analyzing her speech to track improvements. The first week was exhausting, and progress was slow, but Sarah reminded herself that mastery comes from consistent, focused practice. She began noticing subtle changes. Certain words sounded sharper, sentences flowed more smoothly, and listening to herself no longer made her cringe. Sarah quickly realized that one of the biggest obstacles to speaking clearly was pronunciation. She had been so focused on learning new vocabulary and grammar that she had neglected the way her words actually sounded. Mispronounced words could make even simple sentences confusing, and she now understood why people often asked her to repeat herself. To tackle this, she began studying phonetics, the sounds of English, and practiced each sound carefully. She learned to distinguish between tricky pairs like ship and sheep, bat and bet, and thin and then. At first, it felt unnatural. Her tongue and lips resisted forming unfamiliar sounds, but through repetition, the movements started to feel automatic. She also discovered the power of intonation and stress. English wasn't just about speaking the right words, it was about emphasizing the right syllables, pausing at the right moments, and giving sentences a natural rhythm. She practiced reading aloud with emphasis, slowly exaggerating the melody of sentences until it sounded fluent. She recorded herself every day. Playback was sometimes painful. Her early attempts sounded robotic and awkward, but she began noticing improvement. Certain words were clearer, sentences had a better rhythm, and listeners could understand her without asking for repetition. Sarah's breakthrough came when she realized that clarity came from conscious awareness of how words and sentences are produced, not just memorizing vocabulary. She started correcting herself immediately when she noticed unclear pronunciation and actively incorporated new exercises into her daily routine. Sarah's speech had begun to gain confidence and control. She felt empowered by the fact that with deliberate practice, she could gradually transform how she communicated. The journey to speak 10x clearer was challenging, but each small improvement fueled her determination to continue. After focusing on pronunciation, Sarah noticed another key factor affecting her clarity: the speed at which she spoke. She had a tendency to rush through sentences, especially when nervous or excited, which often made her words slur together. Speaking too fast was a silent thief of clarity. Listeners could hear the words, but not always understand them. To correct this, she started practicing controlled pacing. She read short paragraphs aloud, deliberately slowing down, pausing at commas, and emphasizing important words. Initially, it felt unnatural and almost robotic, but with repeated practice, she began to find a rhythm that was both clear and natural. Slow reading exercises to master pronunciation. Shadowing native speakers to mimic natural rhythm. Pausing also became an important tool. Instead of trying to fill every moment with words, Sarah learned to pause between ideas, giving listeners time to absorb her sentences. This not only improved comprehension, but also gave her time to think and avoid stammering or using filler words like or She combined pacing exercises with recording sessions. Listening back, she could identify areas where she rushed or where her intonation dropped, and she would immediately correct it. Over time, this training transformed her speaking style. What had once sounded rushed and confusing now carried a smooth, confident rhythm. Sarah also began practicing reading dialogues from English books aloud, imagining conversations as if she were speaking naturally with someone. This helped her apply pacing and pausing in a realistic context rather than just in isolated exercises. By the end of this phase, Sarah noticed something remarkable. People not only understood her better, but she also felt more confident while speaking. She had discovered that clarity wasn't just about the words themselves, it was about how they were delivered. Slow, deliberate, and rhythmic speech made a huge difference, and she could feel the transformation in every conversation. Sarah was no longer just memorizing English or struggling to be understood. She was learning to speak clearly with intention, a skill that would serve as the foundation for everything else she would master. As Sarah progressed, she realized that speaking clearly wasn't just about practicing words aloud, it was also about listening carefully. The more she listened to fluent English speakers, the more she could internalize the natural flow, rhythm, and pronunciation that made speech easy to understand. She began dedicating time each day to active listening exercises. She would watch short videos, listen to podcasts, or follow English news broadcasts, focusing not just on content, but on how sentences were structured and how words were pronounced. At first, it felt overwhelming. Native speakers spoke fast and often blended sounds, but she reminded herself that the goal wasn't to understand everything immediately. The goal was to absorb patterns of clear speech. Next, Sarah practiced shadowing, a technique where she repeated what she heard immediately after a native speaker. She mimicked the intonation, rhythm, and stress of each sentence, paying close attention to how vowels and consonants were pronounced. This was challenging, and sometimes her attempts sounded off, but the repetition slowly trained her mouth and brain to produce English more naturally and fluently. She also started keeping a pronunciation journal, noting difficult words, phrases, or sounds, and revisiting them daily. Words that had once been stumbling blocks, like though, through, or comfortable, gradually became easier to pronounce clearly. Through consistent listening and imitation, Sarah noticed a dramatic change. Her words began to sound more natural, confident, and understandable, even in spontaneous conversations. She realized that clear English wasn't just learned from textbooks, it was learned from the ears as much as the mouth. Sarah had unlocked a crucial insight. Speaking 10x clearer English required integrating listening, imitation, and practice. It wasn't a quick fix, it was a disciplined daily routine, but the results were undeniable. Each day, she could feel herself becoming more confident and fluent, one sound at a time. With pronunciation, pacing, and listening exercises underway, Sarah realized another key element to speaking clearly: choosing the right words. She often knew multiple ways to say something, but some words or phrases sounded complicated or unclear when spoken quickly. Speaking clearly meant using simple, precise language that conveyed meaning without confusion. She started keeping a clarity vocabulary notebook, writing down words she commonly used and evaluating whether there were simpler alternatives. For instance, instead of saying utilize, she would practice saying use, which sounded clearer and more natural. She noticed that shorter, more familiar words helped her sentences flow without stumbling. She also focused on linking words naturally, like and, but, and so, which connected ideas smoothly in speech. She practiced speaking short paragraphs aloud, deliberately emphasizing these connecting words to make her sentences easier to follow. To strengthen this skill, she began explaining concepts aloud as if teaching someone else, starting with simple topics like her daily routine and then moving on to abstract ideas. By hearing herself speak clearly about various subjects, she trained her brain to select words that conveyed her meaning effectively. Another technique she used was rephrasing sentences. If a sentence felt awkward or unclear when spoken, she would simplify it without losing the message. This not only improved clarity, but also increased her confidence because she no longer felt trapped by complex vocabulary or grammar. Sarah could see the tangible impact of vocabulary choices on clarity. Her speech was not only easier for listeners to understand, but it also felt more confident and natural to her own ears. She realized that speaking clearly is a balance between correct pronunciation, smooth delivery, and precise word choice, and mastering all three was essential to truly speak English 10x clearer. Even with improved pronunciation, pacing, and vocabulary, Sarah discovered that her biggest obstacle to speaking clearly was nervousness. No matter how much she practiced, her words sometimes became rushed or jumbled in conversations, especially with strangers or in professional settings. To address this, she began practicing mindfulness and deep breathing before speaking. Taking a few deep breaths allowed her to slow down her thoughts, focus on the words she wanted to say, and reduce the tension in her throat and shoulders. Sarah also started simulating real-life situations. She would practice phone calls, presentations, and casual conversations in front of a mirror, imagining an audience listening to her. By repeating these exercises daily, she trained herself to remain calm and articulate, even when speaking spontaneously. Another powerful strategy she used was recording and playing back her conversations. Listening to herself objectively helped her identify moments where nervousness affected clarity. Instead of feeling embarrassed, she treated these recordings as learning tools, noting where she could pause, slow down, or choose simpler words. Sarah realized that confidence was built gradually through repeated exposure. Each time she faced a conversation that made her anxious, she practiced applying her techniques, pronunciation, pacing, vocabulary, and breathing, and slowly the fear started losing its grip. With practice in pronunciation, pacing, vocabulary, and overcoming nervousness, Sarah reached a stage where clarity began to merge naturally with confidence. She realized that speaking clearly wasn't just about technical skills, it was about believing in her ability to communicate. Sarah started setting small challenges for herself. She would join group discussions, participate in online meetings, or speak to strangers at social events. At first, her voice still wavered and occasional stumbles reminded her of her earlier struggles. But each conversation became a learning experience. She focused on delivering words clearly, pausing when necessary, and maintaining a steady rhythm. She also began using positive self-talk. Before speaking, she would remind herself, "I am prepared, I am clear, I can express my ideas." These affirmations reduced hesitation and made her speech more assertive. An important turning point came during a team presentation at work. Sarah was nervous, but she consciously applied all the techniques she had been practicing. To her delight, her colleagues commented on how clearly she communicated, how her points were easy to follow, and how confident she appeared. That feedback was both validating and motivating, proving that all the effort she had invested was paying off. Sarah realized that clarity and confidence were intertwined. Speaking clearly reinforced her self-assurance, and confidence allowed her to speak even more clearly. She also understood that consistent practice and exposure were essential. Skills could be honed only by actively using them in real situations. Sarah was no longer intimidated by conversations or presentations. She had discovered that speaking English 10x clearer was not just a goal, it was a skill she could continuously improve, one interaction at a time. As Sarah's speaking skills improved, she realized that speaking clearly was not only about how she articulated words, but also about how well she listened. Understanding the conversation and responding appropriately was crucial for clarity. Misunderstandings often arose not because of pronunciation or vocabulary, but because she hadn't fully grasped what the other person was saying. To strengthen this skill, Sarah began practicing active listening. During conversations, she focused on every word, tone, and pause, ensuring she understood the speaker's intention before replying. She took mental notes of key words and repeated back important points in her mind, preparing concise and clear responses. She also practiced paraphrasing aloud. After someone spoke, she would quietly rephrase what they said in her own words, either in practice sessions or real conversations. This reinforced comprehension and helped her respond more clearly, avoiding filler words or rushed replies. Another method Sarah used was listening to podcasts and interviews, pausing after sentences and summarizing aloud what she heard. This practice improved both her comprehension and her ability to express ideas clearly. Over time, she noticed that she could engage in conversations more naturally without stumbling over words or miscommunicating. Sarah realized a vital lesson. Speaking clearly is a two-way street. It requires not only precise pronunciation, confident pacing, and vocabulary, but also careful listening. Understanding others fully allowed her to craft responses that were coherent, concise, and impactful, making every conversation meaningful. Even after mastering pronunciation, pacing, vocabulary, and listening, Sarah noticed certain recurring mistakes that affected her clarity. These weren't major errors, but small habits that made her speech less understandable. She realized that to truly speak English 10x clearer, she needed to identify and correct these patterns. One common mistake was using filler words excessively. Words like you know, and like had become automatic whenever she hesitated. Sarah began recording herself during practice sessions, paying close attention to these fillers. Whenever she noticed them, she would pause silently instead of using a filler word, which sounded more confident and polished. Another mistake was overcomplicating sentences. When explaining ideas, Sarah sometimes used long, convoluted sentences that were hard to follow. She learned to break ideas into smaller, simpler sentences, using clear structure and connectors like first, next, and finally. This made her speech easier for listeners to follow and more impactful. She also addressed intonation errors. Early in her practice, Sarah often spoke in a monotone, which made her speech flat and less engaging. Through shadowing exercises and deliberate practice, she learned to vary pitch, stress key words, and add natural rhythm, which made her speech livelier and easier to understand. Finally, Sarah focused on consistent practice under real-world conditions. She challenged herself to speak in meetings, phone calls, and casual conversations, applying all the techniques she had learned. Mistakes still happened, but by recognizing them and correcting them immediately, she reinforced clarity and confidence. Sarah realized that mastery was about awareness and correction. Even small mistakes, when addressed consistently, could dramatically improve clarity. Speaking English 10x clearer wasn't just about learning new skills, it was about refining existing ones until they became natural second. Sarah understood that no amount of practice alone could make her speak clearly if she didn't apply her skills in real-life situations. Classroom exercises, recordings, and shadowing were helpful, but real communication demanded confidence, quick thinking, and clarity under pressure. She began seeking opportunities to speak English daily. At her local cafe, she practiced ordering food clearly and politely, making sure each word was pronounced distinctly. At work, she volunteered to lead team discussions or present short updates. Even casual conversations with friends became exercises in clarity, pacing, and vocabulary. One key strategy she implemented was thinking before speaking. Instead of rushing to reply, Sarah allowed herself a moment to organize her thoughts. This pause improved sentence structure, reduced filler words, and increased confidence. Listeners noticed the change. Her speech sounded deliberate, confident, and easy to understand. Sarah also practiced storytelling aloud, sharing small anecdotes with friends or colleagues. This strengthened her ability to use natural rhythm, emphasize key points, and maintain listener interest. She discovered that storytelling was a powerful tool for clarity. When she structured her sentences well and paced her words, her audience understood and engaged effortlessly. Sarah had taken a significant step. She was no longer just practicing English, she was using it as a living skill. Speaking clearly in everyday situations became natural second, and she noticed a newfound sense of confidence and presence. She realized that the journey to speak English 10x clearer wasn't just about technique, it was about applying it consistently in life. As Sarah applied her skills in real-life situations, she realized that feedback was an essential part of improving clarity. Speaking alone or practicing with recordings was helpful, but external perspectives offered insight into areas she couldn't self-evaluate. She began asking friends, colleagues, and mentors for constructive feedback on her speaking. Questions like, "Was I clear? Did anything sound confusing? How was my pacing?" At first, receiving critique felt uncomfortable. It was easy to focus on negative points and let them shake her confidence. But she reminded herself that feedback was a tool, not a judgment. Each comment became a guide to refine her pronunciation, pacing, and vocabulary. Sarah also joined online English conversation groups. Here, native and fluent speakers offered advice, corrected mistakes gently, and encouraged practice in a supportive environment. She learned to embrace corrections without embarrassment and gradually incorporated suggested improvements into her daily speaking. Another technique she used was self-reflection after conversations. She would replay situations in her mind, noting what went well and what could be clearer next time. Over weeks, she noticed significant improvement. Her speech became smoother, more engaging, and more understandable to listeners. Sarah realized a key principle. Confidence and clarity grow hand in hand through practice and feedback. Every correction and suggestion wasn't a setback. It was an opportunity to speak more clearly and effectively, strengthening both her skill and self-assurance. Sarah discovered that one of the most powerful tools to improve clarity was recording herself regularly. Speaking aloud was important, but hearing her own voice objectively revealed issues that were invisible while speaking: mispronunciations, rushed words, or awkward pauses. She began a daily routine of recording short passages, conversations, or stories. After recording, she would play it back and carefully analyze. Did each word sound distinct? Was the pacing too fast or too slow? Were there filler words or unclear sentences? Did intonation and stress make sense? This method was initially uncomfortable. Hearing mistakes repeatedly could be discouraging, but Sarah reframed it as a learning tool. She highlighted problem areas and focused on correcting them in the next recording. Over time, she noticed patterns and weaknesses, making targeted improvements more effective than random practice. Sarah also experimented with different recording styles, speaking formally, informally, narratively, and conversationally. This helped her adapt clarity techniques to various situations, from work presentations to casual discussions with friends. She learned that clear English isn't just about technical accuracy, it's about adapting speech to context and audience. Sarah could objectively track her improvement. The recordings acted like a mirror, reflecting progress she sometimes didn't notice in real time. Listening to her own voice, she realized that consistent self-analysis combined with active practice accelerated her journey to speaking English 10x clearer. By this stage, Sarah had built a solid foundation of pronunciation, pacing, vocabulary, listening, and self-analysis. The next challenge was to engage in real conversations confidently, where clarity could be tested in unpredictable scenarios. She started small, speaking with supportive friends and family. She applied all her techniques: pronunciation drills, slow pacing, clear vocabulary, and mindful pauses. As she grew more comfortable, she joined online English-speaking groups and discussion forums where native speakers conversed in real time. One key strategy she discovered was active participation. Instead of passively listening, Sarah practiced formulating thoughts quickly, structuring sentences clearly, and speaking with conviction. Even when interrupted or asked unexpected questions, she reminded herself to pause, think, and articulate, never rushing to fill silence with unclear words. Sarah also learned to ask clarifying questions when she didn't fully understand someone. This not only ensured she responded clearly, but also modeled confident and effective communication. For instance, if someone used unfamiliar vocabulary, she would politely say, "Could you explain what you mean by that? I want to make sure I understand correctly." This approach reduced miscommunication and helped her practice clarity under pressure. Sarah could see her transformation. Conversations that once caused anxiety now felt manageable and even enjoyable. She realized that speaking 10x clearer wasn't just about technique, it was about confidence, engagement, and applying skills consistently in real life. Sarah noticed that clarity wasn't only about words and pronunciation. Her body language, facial expressions, and gestures played a major role in how understandable her speech appeared. She realized that engaging physically while speaking made her words easier to follow and more memorable to listeners. She began practicing gestures that complemented her speech, like using hand movements to emphasize key points or nodding subtly to maintain engagement during conversations. Facial expressions became an essential tool, smiling while giving examples, raising eyebrows to show surprise, and using eye contact to convey attentiveness. Sarah also noticed that voice modulation amplified clarity. Instead of a monotone, she consciously varied her pitch and tone to match the emotion or emphasis in her sentences. Words that were stressed naturally carried more meaning, making her speech both clear and engaging. Sarah realized that speaking clearly was a full-body experience. Words alone weren't enough. Confidence, gestures, facial expressions, and tone all contributed to effective communication. Combining these elements with her previous techniques made her English not just understandable, but compelling and persuasive. As Sarah's speaking improved, she faced a subtle challenge. She often translated sentences from her native language into English in her head before speaking. This slowed her speech, caused unnatural phrasing, and sometimes led to hesitation. She realized that to speak 10x clearer, she needed to start thinking directly in English. Sarah began daily mental exercises. While walking, cooking, or commuting, she narrated her thoughts in English. Simple things at first. I am making tea. The sun is shining brightly today. Gradually, she moved to more complex ideas, like summarizing her workday or planning her weekend. She also described surroundings aloud whenever possible. For instance, at a cafe, she would quietly narrate, "The barista is pouring coffee carefully into the cup. The music is soft, and the atmosphere feels cozy." This habit trained her brain to form sentences directly in English, reducing hesitation and improving fluency. Sarah combined thinking in English with her other techniques, pronunciation, pacing, and gestures, so her speech became smoother and more natural. Another exercise involved self-questions and answers. She would ask herself common questions and answer immediately in English. What should I cook tonight? How will I explain this idea in the meeting? By consistently thinking and speaking in English, Sarah noticed that her clarity skyrocketed. She no longer stumbled over translations, and her speech became more fluent, confident, and expressive. She understood a vital truth. Thinking in English is the bridge between knowledge and clear communication. Mastery of vocabulary and grammar alone isn't enough. Fluency in thought creates fluency in speech. Sarah realized that practicing English with native speakers was the final step to solidifying her clarity and fluency. While exercises, recordings, and self-practice helped immensely, real-time conversation with fluent speakers tested her skills under natural conditions. She began joining language exchange programs online, pairing with native speakers who wanted to learn her language. Initially, she felt nervous. Listening to fast, natural speech and responding immediately was challenging, but she reminded herself to apply her techniques: slow and clear pronunciation, thoughtful pacing and pauses, simple, precise vocabulary, confident gestures and tone. Sarah also learned to ask for clarification politely whenever she didn't understand something. Could you repeat that more slowly, please? I'm not sure I understood. Could you explain it differently? These conversations were not only practice, they were lessons. Native speakers corrected subtle pronunciation errors, suggested better phrasing, and praised improvements. Over time, Sarah noticed that she could speak naturally, be understood easily, and follow conversations with ease. To track progress, she occasionally recorded sessions, with permission, and reflected on areas for improvement. She combined the insights from these conversations with her earlier exercises, creating a continuous loop of learning, application, and refinement. Sarah had achieved a remarkable milestone. She could confidently communicate with native speakers, her English clear, fluent, and engaging. The journey to speak 10x clearer English had taken months of dedicated practice, but the results were undeniable, and she now felt fully capable of handling real-life conversations anywhere. With months of disciplined practice behind her, Sarah began focusing on maintaining and improving her clarity long-term. She understood that speaking English 10x clearer wasn't a one-time achievement. It required continuous effort, self-awareness, and adaptation. Sarah developed a daily routine that combined all her skills: pronunciation drills for challenging sounds, pacing and pausing exercises, vocabulary practice with clear and simple words, listening and shadowing to reinforce rhythm and intonation, thinking in English to improve fluency, conversations with native speakers to apply skills in real situations. She also set personal challenges to expand her abilities. Public speaking events, storytelling sessions, and small group discussions pushed her out of her comfort zone, forcing her to speak clearly under pressure. Sarah learned to track her progress objectively, recording herself weekly and noting improvements. This reflection reinforced her motivation, showing that every bit of effort produced measurable results. Most importantly, Sarah cultivated a mindset of continuous learning. Even after achieving clear, confident speech, she remained open to feedback, corrections, and new techniques. She realized that fluency was not a final destination. It was a journey, one that could always be refined and strengthened. Sarah had achieved more than clarity. She had built lasting confidence and mastery over her spoken English. She understood that persistence, conscious practice, and self-reflection were the keys to speaking fluently and being understood effortlessly. After months of consistent effort, Sarah reached a stage where speaking English 10x clearer had become second nature. Pronunciation, pacing, vocabulary, listening, thinking in English, and engaging with native speakers all blended seamlessly. Conversations that once caused anxiety now flowed naturally, and she could express ideas confidently and clearly in any setting. Sarah reflected on her journey. She remembered the frustration of not being understood, the nervousness that had held her back, and the countless hours of practice that now felt worthwhile. Every recording, shadowing exercise, vocabulary drill, and conversation had contributed to her transformation. She realized that clarity in speech was a skill, built deliberately, step by step, day by day. She also understood the importance of mindset. Confidence, patience, and persistence had been as crucial as technique. Sarah had learned that setbacks were not failures, they were lessons guiding her to improvement. Looking back, she smiled, proud of how far she had come. Speaking English 10x clearer was no longer just a goal, it was a reality she had achieved through determination, practice, and courage. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to improve your English clarity, make sure to subscribe to Whispered Tales. Next time, we'll bring you another practical and inspiring story to help you grow and speak with confidence. Remember, with consistent practice and the right mindset, nothing is impossible.